I have a question, sort of follow up on the additional catalyst for the 30% hit, and so I'm going to direct this to you, Steen. Can you give a European perspective on what's going on in Ukraine briefly?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, your president included, everyone is getting Russia wrong in terms of its politics. As I think I mentioned yesterday, you need to embrace Russia, you can't push them away. History tells you when they antagonize and when they become aggressive, the real trigger point, and probably the catalyst we haven't talked too much about, is the fact that Russia has been unable to go to the bond market now for 7 tries. So 8 times they try to get to the bond market, they have to cancel every single time. So Russia's running short on money. Last time I was in Russia was in February, just prior to the skirmish outbreak, and it was very clear to me, and I even wrote a piece at the time, that Russia was in free fall even before this. So putting all this together, so you have a Russian domestic economy which is breaking down. It's probably in the worst state since the default in '98, in my opinion. It's literally have no ability to invest, and mainly because the energy sector has been suffocated from capital, among other things because of this BP incidents and everything else that's been going on. So no new investment. They've pretty much taken the froth, the profit of the energy companies, and putting that into the hands of people who don't really need it. So underinvestment, no new laws. Every time I go to Russia, I'm being promised that they'll have a financial center, they will crack down on corruption, and every time I come back, it's just gotten way worse than it was in the past. So that is sort of the line, the timeline in terms of what goes on in Russia itself. And when you put that into the context of European and Russian history, when this happens, there's only one way for Putin to maintain power. And don't forget, for Russian, power is everything. Money doesn't mean anything. Putin apparently rumored to have $14 billion overseas. Or it's not about money anymore. It's about ability to maintain his power. And to do that, he cannot step back. I mean, he couldn't. He's going to bed tonight smiling. I mean, Merkel and Obama this afternoon promised to do sanctions after the election on May 25th. Are you kidding me? He is smiling all the way. And he's smiling because now he has a free reign up until the 25th of May to do whatever he wants. So, and you probably noticed, unfortunately, there's been a few fatalities this afternoon in Europe. So that will continue. In terms of Ukraine itself, you have to realize that why is Eastern Ukraine so important? It is because all of the resources in Ukraine is in Eastern Ukraine. Furthermore, Ukraine historically has always been Russian. It's actually a political mistake that Ukraine ever was, given away. It was, as far as I remember, it was Brezhnev who gave it away. I don't know why. Khrushchev, sorry, that gave it away he was probably drunk on vodka or something when he did it.
But it was all the USSR, so it didn't matter to him.
It didn't matter, and most importantly, going back to one of Chris's main points, that it was during the Second World War, and historically always been the food chamber of Russia. So if you're Russian, so I'm just putting it into context, if you're Russian, you need Ukraine to secure your food deliveries. You need it to secure the mining and resources you have in Eastern Europe. And furthermore, and most importantly, the gas line goes directly through Ukraine. There is no way in hell that sanctions is going to do anything to Putin or what he's trying to achieve. He needs Eastern Ukraine to maintain not only power, but to continue his power game in terms of energy. And most importantly, and at the top of his priority list, is the fact that he cannot back down. What is he going to go back and apologize to the Russians? Is he going to go back and just be humiliated by everyone? I mean, there's only one way forward for Russia, and that is, more and more. And he's winning simply every single day. If this was a game theory, I actually think the Crimea skirmish will be and should be taught at Harvard instead of the other crap they teach at these universities. Because this is a classic example of how you sometimes have to stand for a conviction and not go back. So where does that, sorry for the long answer, but I think it's important with all these small details. Where that leaves me is to say that I am, again, with Chris in the sense that it's underestimated the total factor that it can have on the market, number one. And also understand that Russia is the 3rd biggest luxury market in the world. the third biggest luxury market. That means that one of the reasons why the luxury good companies in Paris is underperforming in the CAC 40 is Russia. And on the other hand, Germany, although they have theoretically only 25–30% of their energy coming from natural gas out of Russia, countries like Finland have 100%, the Baltic countries have 100%, Poland feels so much under threat, and I was in Warsaw less than a week ago, they feel so much under threat that now they have deployed US forces into it. I mean, there is an escalation every single minute, every single day in this one, and it has no victors. This is a thing that only have losers. And that goes back to my final point, which is that the only way you get Russia to the table here is to engage them. So Russia needs the technology and the know-how and the education system and the democratization you have in Europe and the US, and we need the energy. It is the most beautiful marriage that can ever be formed in the world. You have an energy deficient Europe and to some extent US over time, and you have a wide resources and under-invested resources in Russia. So, you know.
And we're antagonizing them instead of.
We're pissing them off instead of trying to help them. And most importantly, politically, you know, Russia is right. You know, who are we to overthrow a democratic elected president? What kind of message does it send to the rest of the world? We just, you know, I don't see any media following up of Russia. That actually, Russia is right. I mean, who are we to overthrow a democratic government? Even before the government was thrown out of office, we were supporting the opposition. We don't even know where the stock market is going, but apparently we know who are the good guys in the world. So we've supported, you know, on and off, the Shah of Iran. We have the mullahs we support. I mean, the US and Europe has been on both sides of every single trade there's ever been, for one reason only, that we could sell them some more shit, right? So I think that is also coming to an end, and I loved Chris' presentation in the sense that we need to realize the world is a finite place, also in decision making and the inability to pretend and extend, as I call it, pretend that we are credible and extend by buying time. I mean, my greatest mentor of trading told me once that that hope belongs in church on Sundays, and I think, you know, we are in a situation where you're all hoping that something comes back, and the reality is everything will change. And I think this seminar has been great for me to, and a lot of you have been saying the same thing. If we continue to think traditionally, if you continue to have these brackets of relative valuation against each other, you are in your model, in the tertiary model, segment, which has no fucking value to the rest of the world. We have never been more obsolete as bankers. When I go to universities, I tell them the first thing is that if you want to be a loser for the rest of your life, join banking.
And let me add one thing. The Ukraine situation has really caught my attention, and some history is important here. So you mentioned the reunification of Germany. 25 years ago, Secretary of State then, James Baker, was sitting down with Gorbachev, and Russia, USSR, but Russia at that point in time, was very concerned about NATO expansion into Germany and said, no, we can't have that. And James Baker went through some good diplomacy, and basically they got Germany to go into NATO, but had an agreement that they would not go 1 inch to the east, right? Well, count forward, they've gone 12 full countries to the east, right? Poland, Latvia, Estonia, et cetera, 12 countries. Ukraine is the last one on the map. So the United States and Europe have been very carefully trying to maneuver that last asset over, and that's sort of a dividing line, because when you take the Ukraine, you take Crimea, you take the only warm water port, you basically neuter Russia's navy. Forget about it. It's not going to happen, right? It just, that there's a dividing line. So we pushed right up to the line, and this is where I love, where I see where my country has gone. John Kerry, who Jim Kunstler, one of my friends, described as a hairdo in search of a brain. Very cleverly, I think he thought, yesterday warned Putin, he said, we're going to protect every inch of NATO territory. That every inch was a callback to the promise that we broke. And that's sort of diplomatic, like, it just feels immature, right? It's just like sort of poking this bear simply to poke it. And I don't know that there's a plan. They might have one, but I'm not clear on what that might be, because Russia's very clearly said, this is it. This is where the line is. So it kind of feels like irresistible force on Russia, the immovable object on the United States, which has only known how to go forward, not how to reassess when we meet resistance and say, how would we get through this diplomatically? So it's dicey, and I think it deserves a lot of our attention, because if push comes to shove in this, I don't think there are any winners.
I think it's just the negative sanctions in themselves are negatives.
So yeah, but there's a lot of context there, and one of the things I deplore is how context-free my news is on all of this. It's like it just happened and Russia's a bad guy. That's where we seem to be in this story, and obviously
and
this
everyone is touting that line. You cannot hardly find anything in mainstream media that does not present the U.S. as the big beacon of whatever goal you want. And here we are one of the most hypocritical countries in the entire world, telling all of these other countries what they should do, and here, thousands of miles away, Ukraine and Russia share a freaking border, and we're telling Europe what's right for Europe, we're telling Ukraine what's right for Ukraine, we're telling Russia what's right for Russia, and here we are meddling in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, where we have no business at all. It's the height of hypocrisy. And my question for Steen is, to what extent does Europe annoyed at Obama for his position, for his outlook, for his take, for what Obama's trying to do here with all of these sanctions? To what extent is Europe annoyed at us?
Not at all. We've given up on U.S. foreign policy a long time ago. I don't think there is even a concept of foreign policy in the U.S. And I don't mean no disrespect. Let me just clarify. I lived in this country. I love this country. I'm all for it. But foreign policy is a joke. I mean, the fact you can't even get foreign news anywhere here of any quality, I think, is a tell sign. But in terms of Europe, the way Europe sees this is halfway where I am. They understand the need to embrace Russia in this context. Also, just because we need to, and it goes back to my #1 premise of everything in life: you do something when you need to do it, and that is why Germany has been relatively reluctant to criticize Russia openly, because the way you deal with Russia is like you did during the Cold War. You do it through the back door, and you don't openly come out and make empty threats, which the Americans are very good at. Certainly your president. I don't know, he seems to have a liking for this word called eventually. I don't know what kind of warfare eventually is, but it seems to be a very scary thing. But it's certainly not scaring the Russians. But I think what really concerns me also, and maybe to pass on the baton to you, Chris, if you think about long term, there are really two scenarios. You have the Middle East still having relatively cheap exploration of resources, but at the same time, Saudi Arabia has the youngest population under 21 relative to it. Isn't it almost inevitable that the uprising we saw in the Middle East is only going to get worse? Because yes, I think you're right, energy, as I think you imply, will go up, but there may be this deflation, there may be this compressed growth for a number of years that can lead to a revolution and a new start, which goes, fortunately back to my almost circular argument that, you need to fail first to move forward. But am I totally off the radar here in terms of being nervous about, Saudi Arabia? I think is one of the first that will fall, because also the policy they conduct is simply wrong. And of course, next to that, Iran, which is coming online now with a lot of oil to the world market.
Yeah, we saw a number of things. It was the so-called food riot happens when you cross a magic 40% of people's basic income goes towards food. You have a much higher chance of insurrection in a country, and Ukraine passed that moment. And so that wasn't the sole factor, but there was a moment there where it didn't take much pushing to get the population to come up and out. And Saudi Arabia has been subsidizing this extraordinary population growth for a long time. But beyond the oil they have, it is utterly a completely resource-deprived nation. No water, no ability to grow their own food, and an extraordinarily large and growing population. And so they have some issues there, and not the least of which is that growing population is going to demand that they consume more and more of their oil. We don't know how much they have left. If you like state secrets, you're going to love how much oil Saudi Arabia has or might not have. We don't know. So we can take some guesses at the reserves, but their largest field, the Ghawar field, beautiful, 180 miles long, 60 miles wide, just a gigantic thing, has been tapped, since the 1950s in earnest, and eventually that runs out at some point. When we talk about the world oil market, what we care about the most is how much is available for export. If you're an importing nation, it doesn't matter if the world's producing 100 million barrels or 1 million barrels. It matters how much is available on the export market. So there you see if somebody's declining in their output and their internal consumption is rising, you actually have two exponential functions working against their export market at once, right? So, you know, if you might get a 3% decline in production and a 4% rise in consumption, you don't get the sum of those two in a decline in exports, right? It's a much higher number. So we're starting to see the world export market pinch, and Saudi Arabia is a classic example of a country that, you know, I think they're pumping close to flat out. Maybe they got a little spare capacity, but their consumption underneath is just rising like crazy. And that's going to be true for as long as they live where they live, with the population they have in the state it's in. So we're seeing a lot of these pressures, and I think that this could be the year that we see more and more of the what we call the food riots. So if you look at Egypt, very interesting. This, you know, allegedly it was Twitter and some you know, policies that people didn't like that caused that to happen. But if you look at Tahrir Square blowing up in 2011, something magic happened in 2010. Egypt became a net energy importer for the first time in decades. By the numbers, Egypt's a complete disaster. 0.04 hectares of arable land per person. They have to import the majority of their food. And they are now a net energy importer. And it was those import revenues that allowed them to buy their food. That ran out, and it was just a year later that they suddenly had the population realize that they were very unhappy with the current situation. There's no way to solve that right now. There's no elected person they can do. It's just by the numbers, back it up. Where are they in this resource story? This year we're seeing some incredible pressures on food prices. They are now the highest they've been since the prior spike that happened in 2007. No sign of slowing down for, I think, a lot of structural reasons. If the Ukraine, for whatever reason, cannot grow this year because they're too unstable and they don't plant, they don't harvest, that will only add to the pressures as we go forward. Who knows what happens with the weather? I showed you all the anomalies that the farmers have to deal with. You know, farming is always tough, but it seems to be getting a little bit more wild. And so these are all these larger pressures, and so the idea of resilience is the most important thing. It's easy to understand nations suddenly saying, you know what happened in 2007? There was the perception of food insecurity, and nations just started hoarding. Nations that were formerly rice exporters held it all back, just made the situation worse. That's the kind of thing that I think we can expect to see as countries, instead of trusting that there will always be a grain shipment that will come magically across, you know, in a ship, that they'll try and pre-buy or stockpile it, which only makes sense in the environment we're in. So I'm expecting to see a lot of those pressures arise, and those uprisings, easy to trigger, hard to control. I think that's the United States lesson in the Ukraine as well.
Twitter wasn't the cause. Twitter was a result. The social outbreak, the lack of food, the lack of energy, the rising inflation was the cause. It just expressed itself in the most convenient way at the time, which happened to be Twitter. And the same thing has gone on a number of times recently in Turkey. And you know what's going to happen there, you know, in Turkey. That's another hotbed where I don't know. Could we have a crisis there between Turkey and Iraq? You know, there's all of these tensions. They're all a result of the causes of various things, of declining energy, of central bank policies that benefit the top 1%. And we're continuing those same policies, and yet we're putting into practice things that attack symptoms. All of the complaint about the rising inequality, the battle over the minimum wage, are attacking symptoms of problems, not the problem.
Mish, would you consider the top 1% not just the fiscal top 1%, but the ruling class top 1% also? Well,
certainly some people are in it, as Steen said, just for the power of it, and certainly there's a number of people there. Look at the amount of money that people are spending on elections. If you've got enough money, one thing we've proven, you can buy an election, and people are doing that. You know, they just, you know, want to get in there and can, you know, have whatever their agenda is. And we see this increased polarization of, I think a moderate would be elected in a heartbeat if we had someone came by and said, you know what, I'm willing to raise taxes a little bit if we cut military spending a little bit. But the problem is the Republicans can't nominate anyone that says, well, we're going to raise taxes a little bit. The Democrats won't elect anyone that says we're going to cut social spending. So what happens is social spending keeps going up. The way compromise works in Washington, D.C. is both sides get what they want. So military spending goes up and social spending goes up, regardless of what these parties say, you know, they're fighting for. Spending just keeps going up. You know, Republicans say they're going to, you know, slash this, slash that. They can barely slash the rate of increase, let alone slash anything.
Yeah, you know, a lot of this falls under just there's two things. One, control what you can and let go of the rest, right? There's a lot in this story we can't control, but there's a lot that we actually can. You know, people, I was asked just in an interview recently, somebody said, so you're doom and gloomer. And I said, well, if you're asking me, is the future going to be just like the past? It's going to be bigger, it's going to be shinier, it's going to be just the same. Absolutely, I'm your worst nightmare. But if you're asking me, are there things that we can do and we should do that are fulfilling and worthwhile and have a lot of opportunity baked in them? Absolutely. I'm a full optimist on that. But I'm very realistic that the simple linear extrapolation of where we were is where we're going is just doesn't, I don't have the data to support that, right? And if the data changes, I'll change too, but I just keep drawing all these extrapolations out and I triangulate them all and says, hey, it's going to be different. And so that the invitation to be different is great. Sometimes there's only two ways people and cultures change. One is by pain, right? You have the heart attack, so you finally get your diet under control. Or two, you can change through insight, right? And it's possible to change through insight. I mean, how many people used to believe in the tooth fairy, right? So, you know, you get some better data and the beliefs change, right? It's not a big deal.
Oh, so it's not real?
It's not a he, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, yeah.
Then what it is. May I just comment for you? Because I actually developed a model for politics, an economic model. I called it the Bermuda Triangle of Economics. And to be honest, I filed this paper, and I've expected a call from the Nobel Prize Committee for many, many years. I was thinking if Krugman could become a Nobel Prize taker, then certainly I could get, because actually I have a model that explains something. So the model is that, of course, a Bermuda Triangle has three angles. One is the stock market valuation. It is the lack of productivity and the high unemployment. How do you keep that in place? How can that actually work? Because it is not the normal characteristic of a bull market. And the reason is that, certainly in Europe, but also, in my opinion, in the US, that when 51% of the population benefits from no change, you have created a monster politically. The monster you create is that indirectly and directly, 51% of any population that benefits from government transfers, social Medicare, and policies that are, you know, sort of looking after your self-interests, then you have no ability to actually change that. And that is exactly why whatever election you have in the world, it comes up with the same result. You have everyone in the middle. I mean, Blair and Clinton with their third way, that was really no way, but they all became in the middle of a spectrum in terms politically. So we are the most boring apolitical population ever. And I make the final confrontation with you guys. You as a crowd, you as a generation are the first entitlement generation. You have not seen anything but bestowment of entitlement you should never had. You have more entitlement than you can actually account for, and you don't deserve them, I'm sorry to say. That's number one. Number two is you are the most average generation ever in history. Think about it. 90% of you own an Apple product. 100% of you use Google search and think that is the truth about the world, despite the fact you indirectly know that they are all sponsors and getting that rank relatively to what they pay Google to do it. You go to the same clothes, you say this, you have the same argument, you have the same sort of thinking on what the market was. And that is sociology boring, and I don't blame you for it. But the fact is that where does growth come from? Does it come from diversity, or does it come from every being a homogeneous lot? I think that is one of the problems. If you are so uncommitted to do anything yourself except for complaining, I'm sorry to say that. I say that with a smile. And then the final point of politics is that I've been called in by a lot of political parties to give advice. I had never, ever been invited back twice.
One more question.
Clearly a gentleman you want to take.
Jim was first, sorry.
I want to just jump back. Chris, you had mentioned in your presentation your sort of struggle with the inflation versus deflation. I think that's something we're all sort of chewing on. You know, debt, it seems to be a force of deflation at this point in time. It's hard to find someone who doesn't want cash in the bank, especially in the bottom 90%. So I wonder, but at the same time, you know, I agree with your ideas about resources in the long run, but I worry about the popularity of farmland with institutional investors and things like that, where their hard assets are something that's been done by the wrong people to some degree. You know, when people in suits are buying farmland, it makes me wonder. So I'm wondering what if you could just share, but I don't know, you know, these are things I sort of puzzle on. I'm wondering if you could share some of your struggles with the inflation versus deflation and how to position yourself in the sort of primary capital space.
Great, so does everybody have an hour? So inflation, deflation, always we suffer, you know, the conversation gets off on a bad foot because people have different definitions for what we're talking about. Again, inflation and deflation, if you're measuring prices, you're measuring a symptom and you don't know a symptom of what. It could be more money and credit in the system. It could be a structural shortfall in a supply issue. We don't know. So food prices are going up, I submit to you, mostly because the input costs of farming are going up. You know, we're having supply issues through weather, and we're having input cost hikes through the fertilizer and the fuel cost involved. So my food prices go up. Is that inflation? Yeah, according to the newspaper it is, but it's not necessarily to me, because inflation, in my definition, is just more money and credit chasing something. So when people ask me, are we going to face inflation or deflation, the answer is yes, as Steen said. We're facing both right now. I can show you rock-solid examples of both. Right now it's a tug of war, and we don't have a clear winner in that story. And if I sense a clear winner, I stampede one direction or the other. I'm straddling, you know, a very uncomfortable fence right now, and for too long. And I'm getting a Charlie horse in my inner thigh. You know, it's not good. But when I look at the long-term issues of where we're going with this, you know, when I said primary, secondary, tertiary wealth, when I say you want to be in that, you know, you don't want everything in the tertiary form, a really important point I forgot to make is that the small and medium enterprises that Steen talked about, that's in the secondary form, right? So the idea is to get into those primary and secondary forms. Farmland is already, in the United States, mostly heavily owned by corporations at this point in time. Private equity already did a tour through farmland 5-6 years ago. This story has been known about for a long time. The #1 landholder in New England for forest land is Yale University. Their private equity people have been all over this for a long time. So this story, what I'm worried about is that there's extraordinary amounts of tertiary wealth, trillions, and there's relatively few hundreds of billions of dollars of buyable stuff. When that stampede comes, whatever form it's in, whether it's deflation or inflation, I'm agnostic, what we're going to see is that ordinary people's access to that stuff will evaporate very, very rapidly. And I would share your concern. It doesn't make a lot of sense for suits to own farmland. And the only solution I've seen to that is a company we're working with that we help raise capital for is called Farmland LP. People with money put money into this. They go out, they buy a piece of land. They bought a piece, 1,100 acres, not far outside of San Francisco. And they take 3 years to turn it into organic farmland. So it's a 3-year certification process. And then farmers lease that out, and they do a very precise rotation, animals and then vegetables. And their measurement for success is the soil improving, right? The farmers love it because if you're a farmer, think about it. You've got a 100-acre operation. You want to go to 200 acres, but you can't buy organic land. So you have to eat the cost of going into debt, take the 3-year time frame for that certification process, and take all of the risk. But now they can come in and lease this farmland, and the farmers apparently really love it. The organic farmland's coming in. It's doing really well, and regular, ordinary people get to invest in this model. So that's a way, I think, to start to bridge that gap. It makes sense. But you know, they have 6,400 acres now and looking to really expand that. But it's chump change in the larger story. But still, we're finding models like that which start to bridge. And so really fundamentally, the prime question that sits under this for me is that everybody who really is the primary holders of that tertiary asset stuff, they have everything to lose if the status quo isn't maintained. Young people have everything to lose if the status quo is maintained because they don't have access to that. There's this giant gap. You either bridge it on your own terms or it gets bridged on some other terms later on. So that's it. So my invitation when I talk to people who have the assets is start figuring out how to share those in some way so that you take your financial capital and start building out the living capital, the social capital, the cultural capital, the experience capital that are necessary for that farmland to be truly productive and useful or whatever that asset base is. And that's what we really have to do because we've been pendulum swing. We've got this complete fascination with all things paper, you know. And what was it, 50 years ago, Einstein was our rock star. Today, who is it? You know, Paulson? Come on. You know, no offense, but he doesn't produce anything, right? So we have to start finding a way to getting that financial capital over into the place where real productivity, real advance, real excitement, real opportunity happens. And so I share your concern that it might be done improperly, but I'm seeing signs of where it's being done right.